Hi, my name's John. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be tier ranking the first 39 books I read for my Read Around the World challenge. I'm gonna try to not go too in-depth in any of these unless I think they really merit it, just because it's a lot of books. So let's go through the tiers and then we'll get ranking. So the bottom tier is going to be Apologize, and I think the books in this tier are active affronts to the human experience, and the author should be ashamed enough that they wrote this, that they want to apologize to anyone that's read it. The next one up is going to be Surprise Derogatory, and this is going to be a tier for books where for some reason I had relatively high expectations going into it, and it just really failed to live up to that. The next tier is Meh. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, so the next one up, and I think I'm actually going to change these, so let's get the colors right. Okay, so the next one up is going to be Met Expectations, and these are books where I had expectations going in and the author just met them. These can be anywhere from good to great books. It's mainly just, there was no additional kind of surprise that elevated them in my eyes. The next one up is basically going to be the same quality of books, but books where either I had low expectations or no expectations going in, so I had that additional kind of surprise element that just elevated the experience, and this is going to be Surprise Laudatory. The top tier is going to be Was I Truly Living Before? And these are books that are so good that I don't really understand how I functioned without them before. In some way, these books either changed my expectations of the genre, books in general, or just kind of changed my worldview. So, we'll go ahead and get started. The first one here is Gideon the Ninth, which I read for New Zealand. It's by Tamsin Weir, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in Met Expectations. I think if you read more detailed descriptions than just the blurb, you'll have a good idea of what's going on here. If you think that'll appeal to you, you're going to like the book. Next, Beauty is a Wound. I read this for Indonesian. It's by Eka Kurniawan, and this is going to go in Apologize. I think this book needs a little bit of explanation, and the reason it goes so low here is I think the author was attempting to create a narrative that functions as a sort of allegory for the oppression and suffering of the country of Indonesia throughout time, but I think it was just really lazy, just saying that this country is the women in the country, and it's just a book that tortures women. We don't really get to see any of the effects on the people in the novel. There's no sort of interiority here where we're investigating emotions. It's just a lot of violence against women without a lot of kind of payoff in terms of discovery or any kind of advancement. Next, we've got Counterweight, which I read for South Korea by Juna. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Surprise Derogatory. I think this is mainly on me. The blurb for this book was a love triangle involving a space elevator. And while that's technically true, I think I built it up a lot more than I should have. It's just a kind of generic sci-fi. Next, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, I'm going to put this in Meh. I don't really remember anything about it, so I don't have a lot to say. Next, Notes of a Crocodile by Chu Mao Jin. This is a book I read for Taiwan, and I'm going to put this in Surprise Laudatory. I didn't have a ton of expectations going into this, but it's a beautifully rendered kind of personal scale tragedy about the damaging effects of self-hatred, denial, shame. I think the kind of personal anecdotes in here are much more effective than the interstitial sorts of things where we follow the crocodiles through the news. So a little uneven, but I think the personal aspects are good enough to land it here. Next, we have The Great Reclamation, which I read for Singapore, and in a lot of ways this is what Beauty is a Wound wanted to be. Rachel Heng here does a really good job of going through the complicated sort of history of Singapore and weaving it into this really impactful personal narrative. Just really wide-ranging, really effective. I thought it was great. Okay, next is My Kind of Girl, which I read for Bangladesh by Buddhadeva Bose, and I'm going to put this in surprise derogatory. It was described as the Bengali Decameron, and it really did not live up to that. Next, we have A Thousand Rooms of Dream and Fear by Atek Rahiki, which I read for Afghanistan. And this is going to go in surprise laudatory. I didn't have a ton of expectations going into this, but this book is a kind of hallucinatory dream sequence where we're possibly inhabiting the liminal space between life and death, or it could just be a straightforward narrative. It's never really clear. I think we're on our seat, the edge of our seats for most of this, and I just think it does a really good job. Next is Alienino, which I read for Azerbaijan, and the author is, I want to say Kurban Saeed, even though I don't know that we necessarily know if that author existed. This is just going to go in meh. It's kind of a generic forbidden love story. There's a little extra flavor going over the impact of the difference between European and Persian cultures that intersect here in Persia, but it didn't do a ton for me. Next is Bound to Violence by Hugo Uolegum, which I read for Mali. I'm going to put this in meh. I think there were some high points here, some really low points. Overall, it's just going to end up meh. Next, we have The Meursault Investigation, which I read for Algeria, and it's by Kamel Daboud. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Met Expectations. This nominally follows the family of the unnamed Arab that's murdered in The Stranger by Meursault, and we're supposed to see how that impacts them, but it turns more into an allegorical narrative for the impact of the French colonialism in Algeria and the development of the independent Algerian government and how that eventually evolves to just kind of enact a lot of the same horrors. I think it was really well done. The metaphor worked really well for me. I enjoyed it. Next is Nervous Conditions, which I read for Zimbabwe by Tsitsi Dangamrebga, and this is going to go in surprise laudatory. I, again, didn't have a ton of expectations for this, but it's a really poignant kind of coming-of-age story that also deals with the impact of the English colonialism on tribal structures and identity and the existing kind of native culture in this area. I think the characters are really interesting. I think that the colonial aspect, both internal and external, is handled really deftly. Just a good book. Okay. Next, we have The Murderess by Alexandros Papadiamantis. I read this for Greece, and I'm gonna put this in surprise laudatory. This is a book from the turn of the 20th century that has a kind of feminist ideology in it, so I expected it to be pretty dated, but I think it was still really effective. I think there was some humor in there that was useful, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of the ideas it was attacking are still present. Next, I read Dead Army for Albania by Ismail Kadare, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in met expectations. I think generally this is a pretty well received book, and I think the way it handles the story and the emotions around the Italian invasion and occupation of Albania during World War II is pretty effective. I think the emotional arc for our general is effective. Just a really good book. Next, we have The Door by Magda Zavo, and I read this for Hungary. And this is going to go, was I truly living before? This is a really fascinating look into a relationship between two women in the present day, and as we're going through the development of their relationship, there are stories, anecdotes that one of the character reveals to us that gives us insight into her pretty upsetting past, and I think it just makes you feel the full range of human emotions. I think it was very effective. It was beautifully written. I have not stopped thinking about it since I read it. Next, we have I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, and I read this for Belgium. This is gonna go in surprise laudatory. I think it's a super effective book. I think for a lot of people, it could probably be in this top tier. It just, unfortunately, I read it right after something with very similar sorts of thematic concerns that I just think was executed better. So this was a little bit of a step back for me, but I think really almost a perfect book. Next, we have The Teacher of Cheops by Alexandro Salvado, and I read this for Andorra. There weren't a lot of choices, and I'm gonna unfortunately have to put this in apologize. I think this is one of the worst books I've ever read, and I really don't think anyone should suffer through this. It's nominally a historical novel that's not particularly accurate historically. It handles a lot of topics in a really ham-fisted way. It kind of cheapens the trauma of things like sexual assault and poverty. It's just badly written, badly conceptualized, poorly executed, just all in all a really terrible book. Next, we have The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, and I read this for Ireland. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Was I Truly Living Before? This book just has so much momentum. You start reading it, it's really difficult to put down. It's a family saga where we're investigating the, again, effects of shame and denial and refusing to accept yourself, and just seeing how that can play out both internally and on the people around you. Very well done. Next is Death and Croissants. I'm going to put this in Met Expectations. This book's by Ian Moore, and I read it for England. This is just a lighthearted, kind of cozy murder mystery that I think is executed pretty well, and I really enjoy the audiobook. Next, we've got Employees by Olga Ravin, and I read this for Denmark. This is going to go in meh. I think it did some things well, but for the most part, I just wasn't super interested as I was going through this. Okay, next we have A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. I read this for Sweden. This is going to go in Met Expectations. It's kind of a formulaic, grumpy old man who wants to die but keeps finding reasons to live. I just think it was really well executed. It came to me at the right time. I really liked it. Next, we have Lilith by Reza Barahani, and I read this for Iran. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Surprise Laudatory. I think the language in here was really beautiful, which is impressive because it's gone through 2 translations to get here. And I just think the poetry of the language, the flow, the novelty, it all really comes through. It enlightened me on some of the topics in terms of like Islamic origin theology that I was pretty ignorant of. It's a subversive, verging on heretical kind of take on humanity's origin. I just think it was a really impressive work. Next, we have Will and Testament by Vigdis Hjorth. I read this for Norway. It's autofiction about dealing with trauma and a family's refusal to accept the reality of your trauma, and I'm going to put this in Surprise Laudatory. I think it was just really well handled. It was very sad, but it just all felt so real. It was effective, well written. I really liked it. Next, I read Reykjavik by Ragnar Jonasson and Katrin Jakobsdottir for Iceland. This is going to go in meh, pretty generic murder mystery. Okay. Next, I read The Hare by César Aira for Argentina. I'm going to put this in Surprise Derogatory. I don't know if it was me just not being in the right place for the book or what, but this generally receives pretty positive reviews. And for me, a lot of the time, instead of seeming like commentary on racism, it just kind of veered into racism. Maybe it's a me issue, so I'm going to put it here in Surprise Derogatory, but I could pretty easily be convinced to put it down here in this Apologize category. Next, we have The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. I read this for Brazil. I'm going to go ahead and put this in meh. I think the writing was fine. Some of the metatextual things were fun, but in general, I didn't really care for the narrative or how negative it was in terms of describing the life of our main character. Next, we have 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I read this for Colombia. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Met Expectations. I think for a lot of people, this book will be higher, but going in, I had pretty stratospheric expectations with lots of people calling this the best book ever written. I think it mostly lived up to the praise. I don't think, for me, it hits best books ever written, but it is really, really, really good. It's just my expectations were so high. It is very difficult to exceed them. Next, we have Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. I read this for Antigua and Barbuda, and I'm going to put this in surprise laudatory. I think this says more about me than the book. I read this right after the book for Andorra, so I had just kind of written off small countries as being capable of producing good literature. So that's probably a bad expectation on my part, but this is a very poignant, heart-wrenching kind of coming-of-age story for a young woman who's developing her sense of self in a new country separated from her culture and past, and I think it's just really well done. Next, we have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I read this for the United States, and this is going to go in meh. It just didn't do a ton for me. Next, we have If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler by Italo Calvino. I read this for Italy, and this is going to go in surprise derogatory. I think, again, this says more about me. I generally don't like surrealist kind of literature, especially from, the Oulipo camp. It's just not for me. Next, we have That Time of Year by Marie and Di, and I read this for France, and I'm going to put it in meh. It didn't do a lot for me, but I do think it's like an easy to get through kind of horror if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Okay, next we have The Law of Inheritance by Yasser Abdelatif. I read this for Egypt, and I'm going to put this in surprise derogatory. I don't know why, but I had pretty high expectations for this. It came pretty highly recommended from booksellers at a local bookstore that I really generally align taste-wise with, but none of the stories in here really clicked with me. I just didn't care about the family or the individual members. Maybe for someone, the quality of the language, the poetic kind of nature of the prose can elevate it, but just not very good for me. Next, we have The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. I read this for Chile, and I'm going to put this in surprise laudatory. I read this pretty close after 100 Years of Solitude, and it's painted as kind of a spiritual heir to 100 Years of Solitude, and you can certainly see the influence of South American ideas of magical realism, and it has kind of structural similarities in terms of the fact we're following a single family through generations. I just think the characters here are a little more interesting. I think the way the cyclical nature of history is worked into this is also a little more interesting, and I thought the historical aspects of House of Spirits were very compelling. So for me, it was better than 100 Years of Solitude, and I think that has to put it up here in surprise laudatory. Next, we have A Silent Fury, the El Bordo Mine Fire by Yuri Herrera, and I'm gonna go ahead and put this in meta expectations. I read this for Mexico. It's a short non-fiction historical investigation into a mine fire that happened in a community, and it's the story of how the American company running the mine tried to minimize the disaster at the time and also tried to control the fallout of it. It's an attempt to discover the true story, to kind of give these people their actual history. I think it was effective. If you're looking for a short historical novel, I think this is good. Okay, next we have The Book of Chameleons by Jose Eduardo Agualusa. I read this for Angola, and I think I'm going to put this in met expectations. It was well written, propulsive, it was very interesting. There were very slight elements of magical realism. It's a story of someone who creates identity for their clients, and one of those clients starts following the history of the constructive narrative, and it turns out to be true. Just really compelling. I liked it. Next, we have Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I read this for Russia, and I think this is probably going to be the most controversial ranking here. And I'm going to put this in surprise derogatory. It's not necessarily to say that this is a bad novel. I think it's pretty good. I just went into it with pretty unrealistic expectations. So this is more a commentary on me. As I was reading through this, I kept wanting it to be at the quality of War and Peace, and for me it just wasn't. I had put off reading this book for years after reading War and Peace, saying, this is definitely going to be a 5-star read. I can read this anytime I get into a reading slump and just know that I'm going to have a really good time. I tried to read it to get out of a reading slump, and as I'm going through it, I just kept feeling like I wished I was reading War and Peace. So, maybe more commentary on me than this book. I think it was pretty effective at a lot of things, just, I would say read it before War and Peace. Next, we have Death in Spring by Mercy Rodoreda, which I read for... I'm calling it Spain currently. I might break this out into Catalonia at some point and read something, from less controversially part of Spain regions. But I'm going to put this in Was I Truly Living Before? This book was incredible. It changed my expectations for what a dystopian novel could be. It changed my definition of what horror is. I think that this was just perfectly executed, and it's a book I haven't stopped thinking about for 7 straight months. Truly incredible. Next, we've got Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which I read for Nigeria. I'm going to go ahead and put this in met expectations. I think I probably would have enjoyed this more had I not read Nervous Conditions before it. I think Nervous Conditions just hits a lot of the same topics and themes in a more effective way, but I think this was well executed and, is a historical touchstone that a lot of African novels have developed from. It's important. I just think there are more contemporary novels that have really improved on this sort of formula. Next, we have Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. This is a memoir, I think, technically, since it's only part of her life. I read this for Scotland, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in met expectations. I think if you read the blurb about it and go into it, you know what you're getting. It's funny. I think it gives some insight into Fern's specific experience with autism. I think just a pretty well executed book. So I think this is what I'm going with here. Hopefully nothing too outlandish, and if you have any recommendations for books from these countries down here in these lower categories that you think are better, feel free to let me know.